Yes, okay. First of all, with Mark and Hedi's consent, I'd like to dedicate our shiur tonight in the memory of Joseph, Zichrono Livracha, Mark and Hedi's son, who passed away. How many years is it now?
14.
14 years ago. The yahrzeit was yesterday. So I thought it would be appropriate. And also we might, if we get to it, depends on how much progress we make, we might study a little bit of something that has to do with Akedat Yitzchak. And in a certain way, I thought that might be appropriate as well, or inappropriate, but I asked Mark's permission, so it's okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay. Of course, we remember Joseph with a lot of love. And to this day, Mark, every time before Corona, I wouldn't just elbow you, but we would embrace in shul. I would, I was always hugging Joseph at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Okay.
And you still have on Friday at Kfar Nachman?
Yes, Elena, thank you. Yes, indeed, at 2:30 in the afternoon, with apologies for the awkward timing. Please bring an umbrella.
Yeah, well, the big storm is tomorrow. Hopefully by Friday it will be a smaller storm.
Yeah.
Okay.
It looks like another wet Shabbat.
Yes, it does.
I'm not happy about that.
Okay. Okay, so we've been discussing, and we're going to end this series and move into a new series, but let's first complete this series about issues of the controversy in modern archaeology around how compatible, how much do modern archaeological finds, how much are they compatible with what Tanakh teaches us, or how much do they maybe contradict? And the last thing we saw was the time of Yehoshua. So we're going to go a few hundred years forward now to the time of David HaMelech. After we go through the time of David and Shlomo, there's still another 200 years or so, but we come to the time of the 7th, 8th century BC, and that's when we reach an agreement. Everyone agrees from the middle of the time of the first temple that things are realistic. What we're talking about is the periods previous to that. So one thing about the time of David HaMelech is the argument amongst archaeologists, historians, whether or not this is a realistic story, or there were just some Jewish tribes, kind of roaming around the area, settling here and there. They were not yet even connected or brought together, come together as a nation, certainly didn't have a king. And the kingdom of Israel was only born a couple of centuries later. And of course, the fact that there were no archaeological finds supporting the existence of the kingdom of Israel earlier than the 8th or 9th century, that was the cause of the argument, of criticism of Tanakh and so on. And so one of the points we've made all the time is that what I called in Hebrew, lo ha'iti eina re'aya. The fact that I haven't seen something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And in archaeology, that's very crucial, because things keep on being discovered more and more and more. Certainly in Eretz Yisrael, last week we described the altar, the Mizbeach, that was found in a very wondrous way, that this person, Adam Zeltar, that we spoke about last time, went around poking around Samaria until he finally found two important things, and the real important one was this altar. So in a similar way, an interesting finding. First, I'd like to show you a picture. And this is the picture. Okay. This is a hill. Ilana, you've heard me speak about it in the past. This is a hill southwest of Beit Shemesh, very near to what is called the Eilat Junction. When you're driving south on 38, which starts from Route 1 to Jerusalem, you drive all the way south, you can get to Beit Guvrin, In the middle of the way, south of Beit Shemesh, you come to a junction which is called Emek Ha'elah. It's not far from the area that is the site of the war between Israel and Philistines, and it has to do with this site as well, with the war between David and Goliath. It's the same historical period. And if you take, this is an aerial view of this hilltop, and if you're a bird who's been flying around in Eretz Yisrael for a couple of centuries, for a couple of thousands of years, you look at it from this vantage point, from this viewpoint, and you say to yourself, there's something here. This is not natural. This circle is not natural.
Can you send me a message? But I can't get to it
Gina?
because I'm on Zoom with my phone and I can't get
Let me
out
try
of
and
Zoom today.
see if I can mute.
So
Okay, good.
but how did you get home?
Got it. Okay. So you look at this and you say to yourself, no, some archaeologists, come dig here. Obviously there's something here. And so it's fascinating. It's been sitting there for thousands of years waiting for us to come and dig it. And a couple of decades ago, people did start digging there. And it's a hilltop called Gilbert Kyafa. Actually, the findings from Gilbert Kyafa were put on exhibit in the museum of, what is it called? Museum HaMikra, the museum of the Tanakh, which is across the street, just on the other side of the parking lot of the Israel Museum in Yerushalayim. And what they found is when you start digging up those walls, this is a city. I don't know how big it looks to us from this aerial viewpoint. And, you know, in comparison to modern day cities, it's not a big place. It's a very small yishuv, but in those times, that was the size of a city. It could include, you know, a few tens of, or maybe more families. It had a very strong wall, and it had entrances that were built, the gates where there were entrances to the city were built in a way that is clearly known as the way that the Jews in the time of the kingdom of Judah built their walls and their walled cities and their entrances, their gates. It's built in the same way. It's called a double gate. And there are two gates. One of the cities that is described in Sefer Yehoshua in this area is called Sha'araim, which means Sha'ar is a gate, so Sha'araim might be two gates. It's controversial. There's no proof that this is the city. You can interpret it differently. But the fascinating thing, digging up this city, and there are these walls and gates, and there's an altar, and there are homes, and three or four fascinating things. First of all, no idols. Right. Everywhere in Canaan, in Eretz Yisrael, where there were idol worshippers, where there were non-Jewish societies, there are idols. No idols in Gilbert Kyafa. There is they found what would you call it? Like a barrel. What are the things made of clay? What are they called? A jar, like a jar. With ancient Jewish writing about giving, what is the pronunciation in English? Tithes? Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah, tithes.
And charity. And so you see these signs that seem to indicate very clearly that this is a Jewish settlement.
Right.
And then you want to find out from what period is it, and that they do by finding olive pits and from all kinds of carbon dioxide tests. And they come to around the 10th century BC, which is the time of David HaMelech. And there's no sign there that says we are slaves or citizens of the kingdom of David. It doesn't mention the name David HaMelech. But the fortresses, the might of the fortress is clearly not a local initiative, a local building, local abilities. It is clearly something that comes from abilities of a kingdom, of a central power in the area that was able to build such a strong wall around this city. And so it seems that it's a sign of a Jewish kingdom, Jewish power in the area around the time of David HaMelech. And of course, this is controversial. Others argue with it in all kinds of arguments. But if it seems pretty reasonable, there are a lot of articles you just have to look up. I never remember in English how to write the word, but in Hebrew it's kuf yud yud aleph pei hey, and then in English they write it hirbit with a Q, Kyafa, something like that. And Google will find it for you, and there are all kinds of articles and discussions and arguments. And now I want to show you one other thing from that city. I'm going to share one other thing, one moment. Okay. One second. Let's see. Yes, here it is. You see the picture? This is a small utensil found in the digs. You can see the parts that are darker are the parts that were found, and the lighter parts are kind of, they reconstructed it, put it back together, and completed what needed to be filled in. This is, actually I saw this is like a little box. You could, it's the thing you have at home, you can put your car keys in it when you come home, things like that, or maybe put your coins for charity or whatever it is you want to do with it. But the great thing about this finding is something else. I'm going to stop this to try and share some psukim. Let's see. Here we go. Yes. Here we go. Okay. You see the psukim here. This is in Kings 1, Melachim Aleph, chapter 6. This is a description of the building of Beit HaMikdash, of the first temple by HaMelech Shlomo. And you see here in verse 31, he made the entrance of the sanctuary. He made doors of olive wood. The lintel and side posts were of 5 parts. The pasuk says, Chamishit, Dlatot Chamishit. No one really knows exactly what Dlatot Chamishit means. It doesn't, even saying 5 parts is not an accurate translation, it's more an interpretation. But one of the explanations of it is that the entrances were built with a certain number of kind of doorposts, moving in and in, making the entrance, making the opening smaller and smaller and smaller as you moved inward. And so it could have just 2 doorposts and it was open, or it could have 2 layers of doorposts, one, and then another one which narrows it a little bit, or 3, and it goes and narrows. Now let's go back to the other one and share that again. Okay, you see that's exactly the picture. There are in this picture 4 such doorposts with something on top which is some kind of other artistic kind of design added. And maybe, I can't say for sure, I can't say there's clear evidence, I can't say, I'm absolutely sure about this, but one possible interpretation of this utensil is that people had at home something that they used at home, which was a reminder of the structure of the temple. That this is the entrance, this is the way the entrance of the temple looked. And they had at home, like you have a picture of Jerusalem on your wall at home, they had this kind of utensil that they would use at home, which was a reminder of the center of the kingdom, of the religion, of the temple in Jerusalem. Again, I can't say for sure, but if it is, it's pretty exciting. It's pretty emotional even. So it's interesting to see, and maybe it's an interpretation of that pasuk in the book of Melachim in Kings. In any case, this is the finding of Gilbert Kyafa. You can go on a tour. You can just, I don't think you need any permission to go in there. I think it's open. You can just go up on the hill and take a look, or maybe you can go with a guided tour. I was there once with some kind of guide. I don't remember, it was several years ago. And certainly maybe, one day we'll make a shul trip to Gilbert Kyafa. Could be very interesting. Maybe even have 2 archaeologists, a minimalist and a maximalist, who argue over these issues. Have them have it out there. Maybe we'll build a ring and let them have a few rounds of trying to knock out each other, of course, figuratively and not physically. So it's very interesting. And after that, there's one other find about the period of David HaMelech, and that is in Dan. It's interesting even to note, what is Dan? The area of Beit Shemesh is the area, when Eretz Yisrael was divided to the tribes, was the area of Shevet Dan. On top, on the hill was Judah, Yehuda, and you know, Jerusalem, and east of Jerusalem is the Judean desert. That's part of the area of Shevet Yehuda, tribe of Yehuda. And going down the hill towards the shore is Shevet Dan. So the area of Beit Shemesh is the area of Shevet Dan, or the border of Yehuda and Dan. And Gush Dan is called Gush Dan, not because there's a bus company called Dan. There's a bus company called Dan because they drive around in Gush Dan. Gush Dan is because of Shevet Dan. But we also know, if you go up north to the border of Israel and Lebanon, and you drive on route, I think it's 99, is the route from Kiryat Shmona, going all the way towards the Hermon. So you have a few kibbutzim there, you have the Banyas there, and you have Dan. And then there's Nachal Dan, a very beautiful, calm, quiet area. You know, if there's nothing, if there's no military tension, it's a very beautiful, quiet area. And there are also archaeological findings there in Dan from Jewish period and from periods of how do you say a something written like a plaque, which mentions a king from Beit David, a king from the house of David, which is, again, saying that there is already recognized in the area a house of David. By the way, I wanted to say, why is that also called Dan? Because Sefer Shoftim tells us that the tribe of Dan could not settle where they were designated to settle. They weren't successful in overcoming the people who lived there. They had to move up north.
The Philistines.
And they went up north to the area which is now called Kibbutz Dan. That's why that area is also called Dan. So Gush Dan is called Gush Dan in Tel Aviv because that's where Shevet Dan was supposed to establish themselves. They didn't succeed, and they moved north and went up to where it is now Kibbutz Dan. So it's just a reflection of the history of Am Yisrael in the area. And by the way, I once checked, what about Ra'anana? Ra'anana is in the area of which of the tribes? And that depends whether the border between Dan or the border of Ephraim, whether it reached, there's a certain river called, I think, Nahal Kana. And the question is whether it reached the Mediterranean in those times or not, or if it changed. Whether one possibility is that the Alkon is the border. So when you cross the Alkon, you're crossing a border from Shevet Dan to Shevet Ephraim. So maybe Ra'anana is in the area of Shevet Ephraim, but it's not absolutely clear.
In the twilight zone.
Yeah,
it's in the twilight zone.
You continue going north, you come to Ramat Menashe, and that's the area of Menashe. South of Menashe is Ephraim, and south of Ephraim is Dan, but it's not clear exactly if Ephraim reached the sea, in which case Ra'anana is in the area of Ephraim, or the beach. This area north of Tel Aviv was still part of Dan, so we're somewhere in between Dan and Ephraim. But in any case, they found this plaque with writing and with a mention of one of the kings, Beit David, a known king, a king that we're familiar with, but he is called there a king from Beit David, meaning that it's not just a new king, but it's a dynasty that in let's say the 8th or 9th century is already recognized as a dynasty that originated from King David. So it pulls us back again towards the 9th or 10th century BC, and that's what we're trying to see. In any case, these are the findings about the period of David HaMelech. And I'd like to say about all these findings, once again, if you don't find proof, it's not proof, positive or negative. Negative can't be a proof. I haven't found proof doesn't mean that I've proven the opposite.
Right.
I'm not saying that archaeological finding is the most important thing for Emunah. I'm also not naive to think that there aren't any serious questions that we have to deal with and different interpretations of Tanakh, and not everything is so smooth and everything works so beautifully, and Tanakh has an agenda. And maybe Tanakh is changing this detail or that detail because it wants to make a point or stress a point or stress one thing and overlook another thing, or take something which was very minor in one period and make it very big and bigger than it was at the time. That all that is possible, but I do think it's valuable to be aware of these things that are going on all the time, to be aware of archaeological finds as they come up, to give people this knowledge and this being to be acquainted with all of these different issues and possibilities and different interpretations, and to give people who have dilemmas at least the option of understanding that there can be different understandings and different findings and proof one way or another as something that's valuable to be aware of. I would like to make one last point before we end this issue and move on to a new issue, or have everyone participate and add if you want to add something. And that is that there are also things that we do have archaeological finds and they're not mentioned in Tanakh. I'll bring one example. That is, we just mentioned it on Shabbat when we study Yirmiyahu in Seudah Shlishit. That is a very big, very important monument called
Mesha.
That's right, Mesha, of Mesha, the king of Moab. Moab is part of the area of Jordan of today. And the king of Moab, one of the kings whose name was Mesha, they found an archaeological big monument that he made of conquerors that he conquered from the Jews. And he destroyed cities, and he killed, and he destroyed our water reservoirs and so on. All this is described in this monument, and it doesn't sound. It doesn't make good sense that he would make this monument and it was all false and all just a big lie, and he made up the whole story, because it's hard to you can hide, you can make fake news, but to a limit. And this big monument, if it was all fake news, that doesn't sound reasonable. And none of this is mentioned in Tanakh, and it's very interesting. But we do find in Tanakh in two places. One, later on in the Book of Kings, in the time of the prophet Elisha. And two is what we're just studying now on Shabbat in Yirmiyahu, in prophecies of Yirmiyahu about different nations, about Moab. We find certain things that seem to express a kind of a feeling or a desire of vengeance, of hurting Moab very, very strongly. In Tanakh, it doesn't seem, we don't find the reason why. And if we put the two together, you put what we have here, and in A, we have one thing and we're missing something. In B, we have the other thing and we're missing the first. You put them together, you get a complete picture, which then leads to first of all, it makes good sense. The puzzle seems to come together. There were a series of wars between Israel and Moab, and at one point, Moab hurt Israel very badly, and later on, Elisha gave instructions to hurt Moab very badly, and maybe we find a remnant of this 100 years later in Yirmiyahu, again with a prophecy about the destruction of Moab, who continued to fight with Israel. Not all of the details are mentioned in Tanakh. So the pieces of the puzzle seem to come together pretty clearly, which leads to the question, okay, so why not mention it in Tanakh? Why wasn't it mentioned? And we can speculate about different reasons. One of today's rabbis, who I quote often, Rav Summit, speculates or raises the idea that this war that Moab hurt Israel so badly was a big desecration of Hashem's name, a Chilul Hashem. And the Tanakh didn't want to mention that. I'm not sure that I feel totally comfortable or convinced of this claim, because we do have other things in Tanakh, destruction of the Mikdash, which is a Chilul Hashem. So why this one wasn't mentioned, I'm not sure. But it's an open question for me. Seriously, honestly, for me, it's an open question. I don't have a convincing explanation for myself why this was not mentioned in Tanakh. And it's a good question to leave open and try and think about and see what we will come up with in the future, maybe a better explanation. But in any case, it's just, maybe it shows us that clearly it's not such a surprise, but clearly Tanakh chooses the parts that it chooses to bring. It's not just a list of day by day events that happen and just putting down a technical list of all the things that happen in the area. It's clearly choosing and picking the parts that it wants to focus on, because, as I said, it has an agenda. It's a religious, a universal, historical, time unlimited agenda. And so there are things that it mentions and things that it doesn't, which is a very interesting question for me to try and figure out what it does choose to mention and what it doesn't. But in any case, it's not a question of believe in Tanakh or not. It's a question of why did they bring this and not mention that, and so on, or why did they stress something which seems to be in Tanakh of greater importance than what we find in archaeology and things like that. These are good questions, but not questions of something that will totally undermine Tanakh, but something that is food for thought and maybe can give us a new insight to something that about the message that Tanakh is trying to give us. And at this point, I'd like to take a break and hear if anyone wants to make some comments about.
Can you see this?
Yes, that's Matzevet Meishah. Yeah. Thank you. That's from Da'at Mikra. Thank you.
I have another one, but I can't find it.
Where is it? In what museum is it in the world? Is it in the Louvre?
I think it's in England, if I'm not mistaken.
You
I'm
think
not
it's in
sure.
England?
I think so, but I'm not sure.
It's either in England or France, because those were
Right.
the two
Robbers.
very democratic nations that didn't
Right.
conquer any other places in the world and steal from their
Right, exactly.
archaeology. So it's either in
Right.
France or in England. Yeah.
Right.
Regarding the city on the hill that you showed to start off with, I thought there was a discovery there about 5 or 10 years ago in Emek Ha'ela, but a recent discovery, I thought, like only a few years ago in that area, right?
I'm not sure. First of all, there may have been new discoveries in the same Gilbert Kyafa because the digging continues. And also there are other things. That whole area is very rich in history and archaeology. And you know, if you can create some kind of a machine, technology that will survey what's under the ground and figure out where to dig, that will save archaeologists a lot of time and effort. And there's still a lot more, I'm sure there's a lot more to find in that area. It's an area which was at one point the border between the Philistines and the kingdom of Judah. By the way, that's one of the explanations, because after the time of the 9th or 10th century BC, then this city was then abandoned. And one of the explanations why it was abandoned is because the border then moved farther west, because Judea got stronger and the Philistines got weaker. So this was like a front post, which is why it needed to be so fortified. And when they managed to push the Philistines further west, then that was no longer an important place. They moved on to somewhere else, which we have not yet discovered, and so on. But there are a lot of things to find in that area. Maybe, I'm not sure, it may be a different site that they found something, and maybe a new finding in that same site. Okay, so here we draw a line and we move on to something new, and the new issue. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just you know, I think the discussion that we've been having over the past few months in this archaeological excursion have been absolutely fascinating and wonderful. And kol hakavod to you for bringing this and with such an open mind and such an open approach. And yeah, it really would be fantastic if we could organize a deal to a site like that, and that would just be amazing, really amazing.
Great. Okay, I'm making a note of that. Okay.
Ilana?
I'm gonna say, I'm in favor of it to you.
Great. Mitsuyan. You know, there's the chevra that walk up to a 3-day walk from Ra'anana to Jerusalem, but we don't have to go that far. Okay. Beseda. Hi. Okay. So we're going to discuss questions of Torah and Tanakh and morality. Things that seem to be things that are commandments or instructions of the Torah or events in Tanakh that to our mind today seem to be immoral. And maybe you might excuse it with saying, well, that was once and that's the way they behaved and that's it. And today we've moved on and we've developed morally. But maybe that's not what you want to say. Maybe there are deeper things to study, to learn about these issues. I'm going to give one example just in theory right now, not to discuss the details, but I'm going to mention there was a writer, how do you say, a sofer, he didn't write, he wasn't a poet. I'm not sure what he wrote, but he was a
Scribe.
Author.
Author, yeah.
And he was also an MK, a member of Knesset, very strong leftist. I'm not mentioning this because leftists are to be cursed or anything like that, but it does say something about his positions on different issues. And he once gave a lecture in a group that I would not know that existed if it wasn't for his lecture. It's called Aguda Liadut Humanistit, for humanistic Judaism, meaning you guys are not humanistic. We are going to make humanistic Judaism. Meaning Judaism very often is anti-humanist. It has certain parts that are against humanism, and we're going to make humanistic Judaism. And he gave a lecture somewhere in I'm not sure the year, I can look it up, see if I have it here. He gave a lecture. No, it's not mentioned here. He gave a lecture, the headline of which was in Hebrew, Neged Yehoshua, against Yehoshua, against the book of Joshua, contrasting Joshua and Isaiah, Yehoshua and Yeshayahu, which is a nice play on the letters, on the sound. Joshua against Yehoshua against Yeshayahu. Yeshayahu is humanistic. He has these prophecies about peace, about universal peace. Joshua is humanistic. He conquers the land of Israel and kills the Canaanites and expels them. Sorry?
No, Canaanites.
He kills the Canaanites and expels them and so on. And he is not humanistic and not moral. But it's not just something that he does. This is a commandment that Hashem commands him. And he poses the question, he poses the question as, if you remember the story in Kings, in Melachim, we have the king Achav, who is a king of Israel, not of Judah, of the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes. And he performed lots of idolatry. He was married to a woman who was the daughter of one of the kings of one of the cities in Lebanon. And she brought her idol worship, her idolatry with her, and he worshipped idols with her. And he's described in Tanakh as, one of the worst figures of kings in the history of Sefer Melachim, both religiously and morally. And one of the things that he does, and his rival was Elijah, Eliyahu Navi, the prophet Elijah. And one of the things that Achav does, incited by his wife, is that there's this nice vineyard near his palace owned by Navot, right, in Israel, in the city of Israel. And he kind of falsely brings false witnesses to claim that he was doing something against the king and he should be killed. He ends up killing him, and as someone who rebelled against the king, when the king kills him, the king then owns his lands. All Achav wanted was to get this vineyard, and he didn't want to sell it. Navot didn't want to sell it. So Achav was upset about it. So he was not a nice guy. He wanted to find a way to kick the guy out, and his wife was a lot worse than him. And she said, well, let's get him killed and take his land, and that's the end of it, which he did. And then Eliyahu Navi comes with a very powerful prophecy, a very critical prophecy towards Achav. And he says to him, Haratzachta v'gam yarashta. Do you think you can both murder and inherit? You're going to murder someone and inherit his land. These are the famous words of Eliyahu. Haratzachta v'gam yarashta. So says Samach Yishal is not the God of Eliyahu, the God of Yehoshua. How can the God who said to Yehoshua, you cannot murder and inherit, murder the person and inherit his land, then give the instruction to Bnei Israel in Sefer Bamidbar that you should conquer the land of Israel and kill and expel the Canaanites, and inherit their land. So is the God of Eliyahu not the God of Joshua? Says Samach Yishal. So this is the first clash or seeming clash between morality and Tanakh or Torah that I'd like to deal with. I don't know if we'll get to deal with it today because I'd like to give an example of one or two introductions before we get to specifically to this issue. But I'd like to mention some introductions. When you come across a clash of Torah and morality, how do you react? There is a Jewish historian called Shmuel Hugo Bergman. I don't know if you've heard of him. He wrote very clearly, he was I would say, he was very Jewish, not necessarily religious, certainly not Orthodox. You know, just passed away a week ago. What's his name who passed away a week ago? The Jewish philosopher, wrote several books. Just passed away a week ago. Sorry?
Eliezer Schweid.
Eliezer Schweid, exactly, Eliezer Schweid. Thank you. Professor Eliezer Schweid. Also, very Jewish, even very much a believer, not a person who was, you know, who accepted, took upon himself the yoke of halakha and mitzvot, but very Jewish, very much caring about Judaism. I read at least one whole book of his. You know, I've read different things, but one whole book that I like very much. And very interesting. I've mentioned it often. It's called Hayudi Aboded V'Yahadut. The Jew as an individual in Judaism, and the main point I remember from the book is what he's saying is, you know, you can try and run away from being Jewish, or you can embrace your Judaism. And of course, he's advocating for embrace your Judaism, which does not inevitably mean only be religious and keep the laws, but make your Jewish identity something significant in your life. And he did. In any case, Bergman, in a certain sense, reminds me of that. Bergman is much earlier, but he also, you know, he was Jewish and he was connected to Judaism. But when there's a clash between morality and Torah, he says very clearly, morality overrides Torah. And I don't think that a rabbi can accept this position so easily. So that's one position, one way of looking at these issues, and I'm not going to accept that position. But I'd also like to mention Professor Yeshayahu Leibovich, who is a very religious, God-fearing man who kept every halakha, at least the way he understood it. And he, whenever there's a clash between Torah and morality, he states very clearly, you accept the yoke of Torah, and there is no morality. What is morality? Morality is my feelings, human beings' feelings, thoughts, and whatever. And if I believe in the Torah and Hashem said otherwise, that's it. No dilemma. I accept the Torah. That's that. And if I have a mitzvah that I identify with, you know, I can forgive you for identifying with it, but that's not the point. The point is to do what God said, not what I feel, what I like. If you like the mitzvah or don't, if you identify with it or not, that's not what's valuable. What's valuable is that you accept upon yourself the yoke, that you do things that are difficult and even difficult for you to accept or difficult for you to carry out, but you do them because God commanded. So this is in a tiny little nutshell, a main point of Yeshayahu Leibovich's philosophy. And I'd like to follow.
You're missing the third way, of course.
Which is?
Resolve the two if there's a conflict.
Okay, so first of all, absolutely, let's try and resolve the two. but let's try and think about how do we go about resolving the two. But also, before I go to try and resolve the two, I'd like to say something about rejecting Yeshayahu Leibovich. First of all, I'll say the following. After Samech Yisrael's lecture, Neged Yehoshua, it was then publicized as an article, and it made waves. And of course, like we know today, someone writes something against Tanakh, of course, there's going to be a lot of back and forth in the Israeli society and media, this way and that way, condemning one another and arguing and so on. It made a lot of noise. And the Yeshivat Har Etzion, what's known as the Gush, Yeshivat Har Etzion in Alon Shvut, made a Yom Iyun. How would you translate Yom Iyun into English? A day of lectures.
Studies, a day of study, I don't know. Okay.
A day of study about this issue. And they publicized a little booklet. This is how thick or thin it is, or this is the front of it. The headline is Musar Milchama V'Chibush.
Yes.
Morality, War, and Conquest. Meaning, Am Yisrael is commanded to go to war and to conquer Eretz Yisrael, but we also believe in morality. How do we put these together? That's the point of this day of studying this issue in lectures, and it was all in reaction to Samech Yisrael's claims. The opening lecture, the opening shiur, was from what I've mentioned in the past as one of my main rabbis, Rav Lichtenstein, Zichrono Livracha. Makes some very interesting points. Maybe we'll get back to them later on in this series. But also Arav Yaakov Meidan, Arav Yoel Binun, and some others. And I'd like to mention one of the things that two of the things that Arav Meidan says there, in short, just briefly. One of them is some of the claims of Samech Yisrael he flatly rejects. And he says it's just looking at Tanakh very artificially. And anyone who knows Tanakh better knows that some of the questions and the issues that Samech Yisrael raises are not really heavy or difficult questions. But he says that doesn't mean, one way of kind of reacting or retaliating is taking the things that he's absolutely wrong and showing he's wrong about A, B, C, and D, and therefore let's just throw him out the window. And the Rav Meidan is a more honest person than that. And I say this with great respect for him. He is today one of the heads of the yeshiva in Alon Shvut. Now, Rav Meidan says, A, B, C, and D is flatly wrong. It's just artificial. There's nothing serious about it. But let's deal head on with the questions that are serious questions. And he says the question of conquering Eretz Yisrael and killing and expelling the Canaanites from Eretz Yisrael, from Eretz Canaan, is a serious question. And we have to deal with this question. We'll get back to that, maybe not today, but we'll get back to that. But before he goes to answer the question, he discusses the basic experience of I have a moral position, and then Tanakh says or Torah says otherwise, and I have a clash here. What do I do? And he brings Bergman, who says, well, morality overcomes Tanakh, and he mentions Leibovich, who would say the decree of God overcomes anything that I feel morally. And Rav Meidan says, no, I don't want to accept black or white. I'm going to say this in my own words, but very much identifying with the direction that Rav Meidan paved here. And I'd like to say, I'll put it this way. The clashes between morality and Torah are growing because morality is developing in the world and changing and evolving. And some things that the Torah says that in the past were accepted by society, today are not accepted. And then if you go and follow Western morality in the world today, your clashes between morality and Torah you're going to have more of these clashes. As a result of this, some of the rabbis today are put in a corner of rejecting morality. And I have these arguments with rabbis. They come to these points where they say, well, honestly, I think it's coming from, they identify with this morality, but it brings them to a point where I can't accept it anymore. So therefore they say, well, I guess morality is wrong. I accept the Torah. I reject morality. There is no such thing as morality. There's only Torah moving in the direction of Yeshayahu Leibovich. And I am very much even afraid of this position, and certainly opposed to this position, because it's kind of taking the soul out of human beings. It's saying
You froze.
Rabbi Tzvi, you're frozen for about 1 minute.
created in the image of God.
Rabbi Tzvi,
One of the things that it means is that we do have some godly qualities within us, and morality is one of them. That doesn't mean we're always right. That doesn't mean our judgment is always 100% accurate, perfect, and just. But we do have a sense of morality. We are not void of morality. And to say when I have a clash of morality, morality is zero, or zilch is nothing, erase it and just accept what the Torah says. First of all, I think it's wrong about us, and it turns us, it empties us of our intrinsic moral qualities. And also it will cause mistakes, because I do believe, as you said before, Mark, that are places where we have to ask ourselves, wait a minute, how can we resolve the two? When we will be successful in resolving them, we are going to reach a different result than just accepting the word of the Torah and not looking into the moral question at all. And can certain parts of morality and the relationship between morality and Torah evolve to a certain extent? It's not all or nothing. It's not that I say either. It's totally nothing in Torah evolves and grows on the tree, new fruits on the tree of Torah, as the Gemara says in one place. Or is it possible that there is some kind of development, or there's another way of finding the way to make the two work together? So we have a question that we have to face here. One moment, Ilan, I'll just finish this point and then we'll hear you. And one example, very interesting example that Arav Meidan brings, and this is what I mentioned at the beginning about Akedat Yitzchak, and again, I'm mentioning that the shiur today is in memory of Joseph, is that think of Avraham Avinu when Hashem gives him the commandment of the binding of Yitzchak, Akedat Yitzchak. Hashem says to him, Lech lecha, kach lecha et bincha et yechidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak, v'lech lecha el eretz HaMoriah, go, take Yitzchak, and bind him to an altar. And Avraham says, Hineni, and he goes and he's walking with Yitzchak. What's going through his mind? And there are different interpretations of it. One interpretation of Rav Kook is that the pasuk says this was a prophetic dream, and Avraham woke up in the morning and harnessed the mule and went on his way. Woke up in the morning means he slept at night. How can anyone sleep at night when Hashem gives you this kind of commandment? So Rav Kook says he had such faith in Hashem and Hashem's commandment that he slept at night. But there's a midrash that says the total opposite, and brings stories about how Hashem put obstacles in the way of Avraham, which is kind of saying Avraham had all these difficulties. He had 100 excuses why he had to turn back and say to Hashem, I tried, but I couldn't. He could have made up all kinds of excuses along the way, and he didn't. But he's walking for 3 days, trying to resolve. Hashem also said to him that the continuation of your nation that I promised you is going to come from you is going to be through Yitzchak. Now you're telling me to sacrifice my son. So what's going to be with the promise? And other questions that he could have raised. So he's walking for 3 days thinking about these questions. And Arav Meidan says, take these 3 days as an example. That's what you have to do. Stop. Halt. Take your time. You have to look into the questions. What is going on? What is the commandment? Why am I being given the commandment? Did I understand the commandment clearly? Did I misunderstand the moral issue? I have a clash here within my own personality, within my own mind. Take some time to look into the issue. 3 days, he uses the example of Akedat Yitzchak, and I thought it was a beautiful example. By the way, the videos that I make about the Parashat Shavua, the very first one was about Parashat Vayera, the parasha with Akedat Yitzchak. It will be 3 years ago, I think. We've been doing it for 3 years or so. This idea of Arav Meidan was the very first video, about 2.5 or 3.5 years ago. 2.25, 3.25, whatever it is. And of course, I take the 3 days to be longer, It can be 3 days, it can be 3 weeks, it can be 3 months, it can be 3 years, it can be 3 decades. You can live with questions and you can delve into them and you can study them and continue to think about them. And sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years. I think I can say for myself, I'm allowed to, I have white in my beard. I'm old enough to say that sometimes it takes decades to find a solution or even a partial solution. I always like to tell the story about my dear father. My father wrote 2 books, but one of the books he published in Bar-Ilan University, and it has to do with something about Jewish criminal law. And they made an evening in Bar-Ilan in honor of the book, like a book launch. And I actually asked, I wasn't invited to, I asked to be one of the speakers, and I was. And I said that I have a perspective that no one else in the evening has about this book, because I've been following the book more or less since my bar mitzvah. 2 of one of the chapters in the book is my bar mitzvah drasha. Not because I taught my father this, because this is what my father studied with me for my bar mitzvah, and it's part of the book. And I've been following my father since about the age of 13, having these issues, dealing with these issues, challenging his mind. How do I find a solution? Finding a partial solution. 10 years later, finding a source. 5 years later, finding another source, and following for decades how this book has been born. And then I told this story at the book launch. Nobody else has this perspective. It's fascinating to see how this issue has been troubling him. These issues have been troubling him throughout, decades. And here we have the result, which is the book. About 2 months after the book launch, I came to visit him at his house, and he was sitting reading his own book. And I said, "Oh, good book. I know the author." And what was he doing reading his own book? He was still thinking about the same questions. He wrote the book. He put it all in place. The puzzle seemed to be complete, but no, his mind was still not resting. He was still challenging himself with the same questions, finding another avenue, another insight, another way of understanding it. So you can grow if you're willing to live with questions that you don't have total resolutions for them. You can continue to grow. If you have all the answers, that's it. You're done. You can't grow anywhere from here. If you still have questions and you don't have all the answers, you can continue growing. So Av Meidan's 3 days can be 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, 3 decades. Take your time, try to look into the clash, what seems to be a clash, and try and look for resolutions. It can be a long journey. Ilana, bevakasha.
I only wanted to mention Cardozo, who writes a lot, Natan Lopez Cardozo, who writes a lot about morality, and fascinating the way he works through some of the ideas, and to recommend that people, look at some of Cardozo's writing. He struggles with it. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. I appreciate that people struggle, and I'm willing to struggle. Not only after I have all the answers to all the questions, I'm willing to try and let's join forces and try and work through this together and look for resolutions. I'd like to mention one other aspect of this. This one is coming from one I mentioned in the name of Rav Yaakov Meidan. I'd like to mention another one in the name of Professor Shalom Rosenberg. All these are people that I've studied with in the past, not Bergman, but Rav Lichtenstein, Rav Meidan, Shalom Rosenberg, I don't know if I've mentioned him here. He is considered to be, if not the greatest, one of the greatest Jewish philosophers in our days. He's not a young man. I studied with him about 30 years ago before we moved to Ra'anana in Jerusalem. And then he was known to be a great Jewish philosopher. He's a religious person, and he's very, very fascinating. I have to say, honestly, I really look up to him. I couldn't enjoy his lectures. I think because he's too brilliant, meaning he was so smart, his pace and the things he threw together, I couldn't follow it. I couldn't make sense of it. The picture was too rich. I couldn't put things in place. I like reading him. The things he writes, he has to put into a structure that's easier for a person like me to follow. And in his lectures, it was too much for me. I love him. He's a great man. and I like reading things he says. And here's something that he wrote, and I'll use some psukim to show you this idea. The first pasuk is going to be the following. Here we are. We are at the time that in the beginning, in Sefer Shmot, after Moshe has escaped to Midian, and he is pasturing the flocks of Yitro, and he comes upon the flame of fire. You see right here in verse 2 in Pasuk Bet, the bush, the burning bush. And Moshe says in Pasuk Gimel, verse 3, let me turn now and see this great spectacle. Why does the thorn bush not burn up? And the Lord saw that he had turned to see, and God called to him from within the thorn bush and said, Moshe, Moshe, and he said, here I am. And he said, do not draw near, and so on. And then in Pasuk Vav, verse 6, Hashem says to him, I am the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And Moshe hid his face because he was afraid to look toward God. Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says, in the Guide of the Perplexed, says that sometimes a person has to, he quotes this pasuk. Rambam, of course, understands this not to be a physical occurrence, but a prophetic vision. Moshe is seeing some kind of prophetic vision, and he's afraid to look. And Rambam says one of the qualities that a person needs to grow in prophecy is to have a certain understanding of his limits, a certain element of I would say, of modesty. I don't understand everything. I don't know all the answers right away. And Moshe is showing this quality, and it goes very well with Moshe's quality of modesty, of anava, which is known in the Torah. So this is one pasuk, and the Rambam understands this pasuk to be saying that Moshe had this quality of modesty, of anava. And then he says, let's look elsewhere. I'll skip to this one. Let's see. Yes, this is the one that I want. Okay. And he quotes a Gemara, the Talmud, that says, here's Moshe's reward. This is after the sin of the golden calf, Chet HaEgel, where Hashem is up on Har Sinai, is up on Har Sinai with Hashem, asking for forgiveness for Am Yisrael and so on. And then there's a revelation of Hashem to Moshe. Sorry, wrong. I'm in the wrong place. I'm in Sefer B'Midbar. This is in Sefer B'Midbar, where Miriam and Aharon speak ill of Moshe, and Miriam is inflicted with leprosy. And Hashem says, why are you criticizing Moshe, who is my faithful prophet? And then in verse 8 in Pasuk Chet, Hashem says that I speak with him in a vision and not in riddles. Mar'eh v'lo v'chidot. Utmunat Adonai Abit. He beholds the image of the Lord. So the Gemara in one place says that in the Talmud that this is Moshe's reward. Moshe in the burning bush said, I don't want to look. There's something here that I shouldn't see. And he's rewarded with this revelation where Hashem says about him that he can behold the image of the Lord. By the way, we have to put this together with another source, one more source, which says the following, and that's the one that I was mentioning before. This one, where Moshe, after the sin of the golden calf, asks to see Hashem. You see here in verse 18, Hashem, show me now your glory. And Hashem says to him in Pasuk 20, verse 20, you will not be able to see my face, for man shall not see me and live. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, what is the relationship between the pasuk here and the pasuk in Sefer B'Midbar? What did Moshe see? What Moshe did not see? But he saw whatever a human being can see. That's what Sefer B'Midbar seems to be saying. And in the Gemara, actually, there's an argument whether Moshe was doing right, that he didn't want to look in the burning bush or not, in the sneh. But think of the idea, says Professor Rosenberg, that to grow in your understanding, you have to be willing to accept that sometimes you have to take a step back. I don't understand everything. There are some things that are beyond me, that some things maybe are even beyond human comprehension. And take a step back and be willing to accept that. And that will not limit you, that will help you grow. Because if you don't understand your limits, you're pushing beyond your limits and you're gonna, how should I put it in words? You're going to trip over your own, your own shoelaces, so to speak. You're going to trip over your own mistakes. And you're not gonna grow. You're gonna think you're growing, but you're gonna try and reach places that you're not ready for, and you're not gonna find the right thing. So sometimes, says Shalom Rosenberg, sometimes philosophers, and he is a philosopher, are not willing to take this step back and not willing to accept that there's something we don't understand. And therefore, where there seem to be clashes between philosophy and belief and faith and religion, sometimes philosophers are sure that we know better because we understand. And they're not willing to take a step back and say, you know what, there's something I shouldn't look at. There's somewhere that I can't look, that I don't see everything clearly, and I have to take a step back. And Dafka Moshe Rabbeinu, who was willing to take the step back and say, I'm not ready for this. I'm not at the level that I can see what's being shown to me here. Dafka, because of that, he could reach later on a higher level or the highest level. And I always say, the person who can reach the highest revelation of Torah from Hashem is the person who is also the most modest person, because he's willing to, it's not about me. It's not about what I can see and what I can achieve. It's about being willing to be a vessel of what Hashem is going to show me. So in any case, I think that's all. These are two very interesting points. When we have these clashes, we're not going to answer the question today about the God of Eliyahu and the God of Yoshua. We're not going to answer that question today. We'll get back to that the next time we meet. But I'd like to leave us today with this introduction to the issue of clashes between Torah and morality. Let's take a step back. Do we understand everything? Let's try. Let's look for resolutions. Let's not accept the opinion that says totally A overcomes B, and also not totally B overcomes A. Let's try and see if there's something that we haven't yet understood and grow in our understanding, and then come back to the issue that is being difficult for us. And we will try to achieve this in our next shiurim. I have to say, I'm not sure we will have a shiur in 2 weeks. I might be away, it's not final. And also in 3 weeks, I might have something else. So even if I'm away in 2 weeks, they might have to wait 4 weeks now, we'll see. But what we will, so it's good to leave us with this, with a question. Is the God of Eliyahu not the God of Yoshua? That's a question we have to look into the next time we meet. And before we end, if anyone wants to react or say something about these thoughts, please go right ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to come to one of the difficulties you started with at the beginning, which was, how can we be commanded to kill and all this kind of stuff. There was always a difficult translation because the commandment, is the commandment thou shalt not kill, or is the commandment thou shalt not murder? And there's a very fundamental difference. Killing sometimes is justified, sadly, but sometimes it's justified. Murder is something premeditated, it's something different entirely. I was always confused about that. People are willing to sometimes take one translation and sometimes take the other translation.
Thank you. Very interesting. I never thought of that.
Oh, he's right.
It will be part of what we will come to later on.
I was taught that there's a difference.
Yeah, there is a difference, of course.
Big difference. Huge difference.
Yeah.
All the difference in the world.
Yeah, of course. Well, the Torah discusses premeditated and premeditated murder or not.
Yeah, but
when it's
that's
an
not
accident.
enough. Premeditation is not enough in this case because they were commanded to do it. But
Right.
But still, even
But
when you're commanded to initiate killing someone, there's a difference between murdering and killing for just reasons. So we have to look for the just reasons here.
But we also have to remember that when Joshua came, when they came to the land, they tried to ask the people to surrender. They did not, they
That can
they
be part
wanted
of the
peace.
answer. That can be part of the answer, but that also is not enough.
Okay, so,
But
Okay.
you're you know, we're working our way. We're working our way. We're making progress.
okay,
Okay.
Okay.
Before you go, I
Yeah.
love you. I love your story about your dad. That was such a
Thank you.
beautiful story.
Hmm.
Such a beautiful
you.
story.
It's that's where I come from. So I understand
nice.
why I can live with questions also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Laila tov.
Thank you.
all.
Laila tov.
Laila tov.